Life Stories brings you heartfelt tales that remind us of the power of love, resilience, and unexpected connections. Today, we share the journey of Rachel, a devoted mother, and her son Ethan, whose innocent curiosity leads them to an extraordinary discovery about family, when a chance encounter introduces billionaire Jack Preston into their lives. They must navigate doubt, trust, and the meaning of belonging. It's a story about finding hope in the most unexpected places and building a new kind of family. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to begin today's story with Life Stories. The mall was alive with the sights and sounds of the holiday season. A spectacle of glittering lights, cheerful music, and bustling crowds. Twinkling garlands wrapped around railings, while a grand Christmas tree stood proudly in the atrium, adorned with shimmering ornaments that reflected the joy of the season. The smell of cinnamon, pine, and the faint aroma of freshly baked pretzels wafted through the air, adding warmth to the wintry atmosphere outside. Shoppers, some hurried and others leisurely, moved from store to store, their hands laden with brightly colored bags. Ethan's wide hazel eyes darted from one display to another, taking in the holiday magic with the kind of wonder only an 8-year-old could muster. His curly brown hair bounced slightly as he tugged on his adoptive mother Rachel's hand, eager to explore every corner of the festive mall. Rachel smiled softly at him, though her heart felt a little heavier than she let on. This year had been hard on them both, and their shopping trip was more about fulfilling practical needs than indulging in holiday splurges. Rachel clutched a modest shopping list, its contents reflecting the constraints of their budget. A single line at the bottom. Hot chocolate was the only indulgence she'd allowed herself to promise Ethan. It was a small treat, but she hoped it would bring him some joy, especially since the shiny toys in the store windows, the ones that made his eyes light up, weren't part of their reality this year. "Mom, can we see the big tree again before we leave?" Ethan asked, his voice brimming with excitement as they walked past a toy store filled with dazzling displays. Rachel glanced down at him, her tiredness melting away momentarily under his hopeful gaze. "Sure, honey," she said. "We'll swing by after we finish at the bookstore." Ethan beamed, his excitement contagious as he skipped alongside her, his small hand clutching hers tightly as they weaved through the bustling crowd. They had just passed the food court when a voice boomed through the mall speakers, momentarily silencing the hum of chatter around them. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jack Preston, founder of the Preston Foundation, here to speak about their holiday charity drive." Rachel froze, her heart skipping a beat at the mention of the name. Jack Preston. It was a name she had read about in magazines and newspapers. The name of a man who had become something of a legend. Jack was a tech mogul turned philanthropist, known for his unapproachable demeanor, sharp suits, and staggering wealth. Though she had never met him, his name had lingered in her mind for years, a ghostly whisper tied to unanswered questions. She glanced toward the stage near the enormous Christmas tree, where a tall, composed man in a sleek navy suit took the microphone. He stood with the kind of confidence that commanded attention, his voice calm and steady as he began to speak about the importance of helping underserved children during the holidays. Ethan's gaze followed hers, his bright eyes narrowing in curiosity as he studied the man. Rachel expected him to lose interest. It wasn't often a child was captivated by a charity speech, but instead, Ethan tugged on her sleeve. His voice was clear and loud enough to turn a few heads around them. "Mom," he said, pointing at the man on stage. "This man looks just like me." Rachel's breath caught, her pulse quickening as she crouched down to meet Ethan's wide-eyed gaze. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into her chest. Ethan pointed again, his small finger unwavering as he stared at Jack. "His nose, his eyebrows, they're the same as mine. Don't you see it?" Rachel turned her head back toward the stage, her gaze shifting between the confident billionaire and her son. She wanted to dismiss Ethan's observation as a child's overactive imagination. But the resemblance was undeniable. Jack's sharp features, his piercing hazel eyes, they mirrored Ethan's in a way that made her stomach twist. Forcing a smile, she squeezed Ethan's shoulder gently. "It's just a coincidence. Sweetheart. Lots of people can look a little alike." But Ethan shook his head, his voice rising in protest. "It's not just a little. Mom. He really does. Maybe he's my real dad." Rachel's heart sank, 1,000 emotions swirling within her: fear, doubt, and a pang of something she couldn't quite name. She glanced around, noticing a few onlookers who had overheard Ethan's outburst. Heat crept into her cheeks as she stood, gripping his hand a little tighter. "Ethan," she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Let's go. We need to finish our shopping." "But Mom." "Now." "Ethan." Reluctantly, Ethan let her guide him away from the crowd, though he kept craning his neck to steal one last glance at the man on stage. Jack, engrossed in his speech, didn't seem to notice the boys' intense scrutiny. As they walked, Rachel's thoughts raced. She had always been honest with Ethan about his adoption, telling him what little she knew about his birth mother, a young woman who couldn't care for him. She had never mentioned his father because, in truth, she didn't know anything about him. His adoption had been closed, with no details about his biological father. For years, Rachel had told herself it didn't matter, she had given Ethan all the love he needed. But now, her son's innocent observation had stirred something she hadn't expected: doubt. "Mom, are you mad at me?" Ethan asked quietly, breaking the silence. Rachel stopped and knelt down, cupping his face in her hands. "Of course not. Sweetheart. I could never be mad at you. Then why did we have to leave? Don't you want to know if he's really my dad?" Rachel hesitated, searching for the right words. "Ethan, just because someone looks like you doesn't mean they're your family. Families aren't about looking the same, they're about love. And you and I have plenty of that. Don't we?" Ethan nodded slowly, though his expression remained thoughtful. "Yeah, but what if he is? Wouldn't he want to know about me?" Rachel's chest tightened. How could she explain to a child the complexities of such a situation? She kissed his forehead and stood, taking his hand again. "Let's not worry about that right now. Okay? Let's get you that hot chocolate I promised." Ethan didn't protest, though she could tell his mind was still turning. As they headed toward the food court, Rachel couldn't help glancing back toward the stage. Jack was still there, smiling faintly as the crowd applauded his speech. For a brief moment, his gaze swept over the audience and landed in her direction. Rachel quickly looked away, her heart pounding as she hurried Ethan along. That night, as she tucked Ethan into bed, his earlier words echoed in her mind. "This man looks just like me." No matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, the resemblance lingered, haunting her. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. But deep down, a small, persistent voice whispered, "What if it's not?" As she sat in the quiet of their modest living room later that night, the day's events played over and over in her mind. She told herself she was being ridiculous. Jack Preston was a man of immense wealth and power, far removed from their simple life. Yet Ethan's innocent words had tugged at something deep inside her, a thread she wasn't sure she wanted to unravel. The days that followed their visit to Willow Creek Mall were unusually quiet. Ethan, typically brimming with energy and enthusiasm, seemed more subdued, his mind occupied by thoughts he couldn't yet articulate. Rachel noticed it in the way he lingered over his breakfast cereal, poking at the soggy flakes with his spoon rather than devouring them with his usual gusto. She noticed it in the silence during their evening routines, where his endless chatter about school, dinosaurs, or superheroes had been replaced with thoughtful pauses. "Ethan, are you feeling okay?" Rachel finally asked one morning as they sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains. He hesitated, his spoon hovering over the bowl before setting it down. "Mom, do you know who my dad is?" His voice was soft. But the question hit Rachel like a freight train. It wasn't the first time he had asked about his biological parents. But this time, it felt different, more deliberate, more urgent. Rachel's hands tightened around her coffee mug as she searched for the words that wouldn't disappoint him. "Ethan, I've told you before. Your birth mom loved you very much. But she wasn't able to take care of you. That's why I got to be your mom. As for your dad," she paused, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "I don't know much about him." Ethan's hazel eyes met hers, his expression serious beyond his years. "Do you think he's still out there?" Rachel's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. She reached across the table to take his small hand in hers. "Sweetheart, I don't know. But what I do know is that you're loved more than anything in this world. By me." He nodded slowly, though she could tell his curiosity hadn't been satisfied. For the rest of the morning, Ethan remained quiet, his gaze distant as he worked on his math homework. Rachel's chest tightened with worry. She had always been honest with him about his adoption. But she had intentionally kept the details sparse, fearing what delving into the past might uncover. Now, it seemed those very details were determined to surface. And she didn't know if she was ready. While Ethan played in the living room that evening, Rachel sat on her bed with a worn showbox in front of her. It was the box she kept tucked away in her closet, filled with every piece of paperwork, photo, and memento related to Ethan's adoption. She hadn't opened it in years. Not since he had come into her life. The lid felt heavier than it should have, as though lifting it would also lift the veil of stability she had so carefully constructed. Inside, the contents were sparse: the official adoption certificate, consent forms, a photograph of Ethan's birth mother, and a brief letter she had written to the adoptive parents. Rachel studied the photo. The image of a young woman with soft eyes and a timid smile. Claire Anderson. She had studied that face countless times over the years, wondering what kind of person she had been, what kind of life she had lived. But there were no clues about Ethan's father. No name. No mention. Not even a hint. The letter was equally vague. A heartfelt message thanking the adoptive parents for giving her son a loving home. It carried an undercurrent of sorrow, as though Claire had been carrying a burden she couldn't share. Rachel closed the box with a sigh, her mind racing with questions she had long suppressed. Who was Ethan's father? Why hadn't he been part of the adoption process? And why did Ethan look so much like Jack Preston? Across the city, Jack Preston sat alone in his sprawling penthouse, a glass of scotch in hand as he gazed out at the city skyline. The boy's face had been haunting him since that day at the mall. He couldn't explain why, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about the child. Jack rarely paid attention to children in crowds, they usually blended into the background noise of life. But this boy was different. For a fleeting moment during his speech, their eyes had locked, and Jack had felt a strange sense of recognition he couldn't shake. He set his glass down and opened a drawer in his desk, pulling out an old photograph. The edges were worn, the image slightly faded, but the woman in it was as vivid in his memory as the day they had met. Claire. They had been together briefly, a relationship that had burned bright but ended abruptly when her quiet demeanor clashed with his ambition. She had disappeared from his life just as quickly as she had entered it, leaving behind unanswered questions that he had never pursued. Jack traced a finger over the photograph, his chest tightening. Could it be possible? Could the boy be? No, he told himself. It was ridiculous. Claire would have told him if she had been pregnant. Wouldn't she? Against his better judgment, Jack picked up the phone and called his assistant. "I need you to find someone," he said. His voice clipped. "Her name is Claire Anderson. Check every record. Social media. Anything you can find. She lived in the city about 9 years ago." His assistant hesitated but quickly agreed. "Yes, sir. I'll start immediately." As Jack ended the call, He leaned back in his chair, the photograph still in his hand. The rational part of his mind told him he was being absurd, chasing ghosts that had no bearing on his present. But the father in him, a part he had never allowed himself to acknowledge, demanded answers. Meanwhile, Rachel lay awake in her modest bedroom, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. She had always told herself that Ethan's past didn't matter, that their love was enough to fill any gaps. But now, with the resemblance between her son and Jack Preston glaring her in the face, she wasn't so sure. What if Ethan deserved answers? What if finding the truth meant unraveling the life they had built together? As the night stretched on, two people, worlds apart, grappled with the same question. For Rachel, it was about protecting her son from the chaos the truth might bring. For Jack, it was about uncovering a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. And for both of them, it was about a boy whose quiet curiosity was about to change everything. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she set her phone down on the table. The adoption agency had been polite but firm. Claire Anderson had insisted on a closed adoption, and they could share no additional details about Ethan's biological father. But one small piece of information stood out. Something the woman on the other end of the line had mentioned hesitantly, as if it were an afterthought. The notes do indicate that Claire left a message. Just in case, the woman had said, her tone cautious. A message? Rachel had pressed, her breath catching. Yes. She mentioned that if the child's father ever came forward, he might want to know about the adoption. She didn't name him, but she said he was someone who wouldn't easily be forgotten. Those words echoed in Rachel's mind as she stared at Ethan, who was sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, sketching a picture of a dinosaur. His hazel eyes, so much like Jack Preston's, were narrowed in concentration as he carefully shaded the creature's tail. Someone who wouldn't easily be forgotten. She felt a chill run down her spine. Could Jack really be Ethan's father? The possibility seemed both absurd and terrifying. Rachel had spent years shielding Ethan from uncertainty, determined to give him a stable, loving home. But now, doubts and questions clawed at her resolve. What if Ethan deserved answers? What if she owed it to him to find out the truth? No matter how much it frightened her. Across the city, Jack Preston's assistant knocked lightly on his office door before stepping inside. Jack barely looked up from the stack of photographs spread across his desk. "I've tracked down Claire Anderson," the assistant said, her voice efficient but tinged with curiosity. "She passed away 8 years ago, shortly after giving birth to a boy. The adoption records are sealed, but I've cross-referenced some details. It's likely the child was adopted by a woman named Rachel Whittaker." Jack sat back in his chair, his sharp features tense. Rachel Whittaker. He hadn't heard of her before, but the name resonated now, tying itself to the image of the boy he'd seen at the mall. Ethan. The name felt strange on his tongue, but it also felt right, as if it belonged to someone he should have known all along. "What do we know about Rachel?" Jack asked. His tone clipped. "She's a single mother," the assistant replied, consulting her tablet. "She works at a local non-profit organization. Modest income. Small house in the suburbs. From what I can tell, she's raised Ethan on her own since his adoption." Jack's chest tightened. A single mother. He could picture it now, a woman juggling work and parenthood, doing everything in her power to give a child the life he deserved. He felt an unexpected pang of guilt. Had Claire tried to tell him about the pregnancy? Had he been too absorbed in his ambition to notice the signs? "I'd like to meet her," Jack said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Arrange it." The assistant hesitated. "Are you sure that's wise? It's a delicate situation. You might not get the response you're hoping for." "I need answers," Jack replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "For myself. And for Ethan." 2 days later, Rachel's phone rang, the unfamiliar number sending a spike of anxiety through her chest. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Ms. Whitaker, the voice on the other end asked. Formal but warm. This is Allison. Mr. Jack Preston's assistant. He'd like to meet with you to discuss an important matter regarding your son. Rachel's breath caught. The name alone was enough to send her thoughts spiraling. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. What exactly does Mr. Preston want? He'd like to meet in person to explain. Allison said. I understand this is unexpected. But he believes it's important for all of you. Rachel hesitated, torn between fear and an overwhelming need for clarity. Finally, she nodded, though Allison couldn't see it. All right. I'll meet with him. But Ethan doesn't know anything about this yet. And I'd like to keep it that way until I'm sure. Of course. Allison replied. We'll keep it discreet. The meeting was arranged for a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. A neutral space far from prying eyes. Rachel arrived early, her nerves frayed as she sipped a lukewarm tea she hadn't ordered. She glanced at the clock on the wall, the minutes crawling by like hours. Then the door opened, and Jack Preston stepped inside. He was taller than she remembered from the stage. His tailored suit a subtle navy that seemed less imposing in the softer light of the cafe. His piercing hazel eyes locked onto hers. And for a moment, Rachel felt exposed, as though he could see straight through her carefully constructed armor. Ms. Whitaker, he asked, his voice warm but restrained. Thank you for meeting with me. Rachel nodded stiffly, gesturing for him to sit. You said this was about Ethan, she began, her tone guarded. What do you want? Jack hesitated, uncharacteristically unsure of himself. He had given speeches to rooms full of CEOs and world leaders. But now, sitting across from this woman, he found himself struggling to find the right words. I think Ethan might be my son, he said finally, his voice quieter than he had intended. Rachel's eyes widened, and she instinctively crossed her arms. What makes you think that? Jack leaned forward, his expression earnest. I knew Claire Anderson. We had a relationship years ago. When I saw Ethan at the mall, the resemblance was undeniable. I had to find out more. So you hired someone to dig into our lives? Rachel's voice rose slightly, her protective instincts flaring. I did. Jack admitted, his tone steady but apologetic. I know it was intrusive, and I'm sorry. But if Ethan is my son, I need to know. For his sake. Rachel's mind raced. She wanted to shut him out, to protect Ethan from whatever upheaval this revelation might bring. But there was something in Jack's eyes, a sincerity that softened the edges of her anger. If he is your son, she said finally, her voice trembling slightly, what do you expect to happen? Do you want to take him away from me? Jack shook his head emphatically. No. I can see how much you love him. How well you've cared for him. I would never do that. But I want to be a part of his life, if you'll let me. Rachel studied him, her defenses still high but beginning to crack. I need time to think about this, she said. And I'm not making any promises. Take all the time you need. Jack replied, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. The days after the meeting were a whirlwind of emotions for Rachel. Jack Preston was Ethan's father. The truth was a weight she hadn't expected to carry, and she felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether stepping forward would lead to solid ground or a free fall. Every moment of hesitation came back to one question: what was best for Ethan? She hadn't told Ethan yet. How could she? The world as he knew it was safe and small, their little house. The routine of school, bedtime stories, and weekend pancakes. Jack Preston's entrance into that world threatened to shake its very foundation. But Rachel couldn't deny that Ethan deserved the truth. And maybe, just maybe, Jack deserved a chance to know his son. The next weekend, she decided to take the first step. They met at a park near Rachel's neighborhood. An open, sunny space where Ethan could feel comfortable. Jack arrived early, dressed casually in a sweater and jeans that softened his usually imposing presence. He looked nervous, his hands in his pockets as he scanned the playground for Rachel and Ethan. When Ethan spotted him, he tilted his head curiously, clutching Rachel's hand a little tighter. "Who's that?" "Mom," he asked. Rachel crouched down to his level, her heart pounding. "That's Jack," she said softly. He's someone who wanted to meet you. Is that okay?" Ethan's hazel eyes, so much like Jack's, studied her face. Then he nodded. "Okay." Jack approached them slowly, his usual confidence tempered by uncertainty. He crouched down when he reached them, so he was at Ethan's eye level. "Hi, Ethan," he said, his voice warm but unsure. "I'm Jack." Ethan looked at him for a long moment before breaking into a shy smile. "You're really tall." Jack chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Yeah, I guess I am. But I bet you're really fast." "Are you faster than me?" Ethan grinned. "Probably." "Wanna race?" Jack asked, glancing at Rachel for permission. She gave a small nod, her heart tight with emotion as she watched them. Ethan didn't hesitate. He took off down the path, his laughter ringing out as Jack pretended to stumble and lose. Rachel stood back, watching them from a distance. It was surreal, seeing her son and Jack together, their shared features unmistakable. It was a moment she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. And yet here it was, unfolding before her eyes. Over the next few weeks, Rachel allowed Jack to spend more time with Ethan, always in casual, low-pressure settings. They went to the science center, explored the local library, and shared ice cream at a corner shop Ethan loved. Rachel was always there, watching carefully, her protective instincts still in full force. But she couldn't deny the change she saw in Ethan. He lit up around Jack, his natural curiosity and boundless energy drawing Jack out of his usually reserved shell. For Jack, these moments with Ethan were transformative. He had spent years chasing success, building his empire, and climbing higher and higher on the corporate ladder. But all the accolades and wealth seemed hollow compared to the simple joy of hearing Ethan laugh or watching him light up as he described his favorite dinosaur. Jack found himself wanting to slow down, to savor these moments, to learn what it meant to be a father. One Saturday afternoon, Jack brought Ethan a small model rocket kit, something he had loved as a child. They spent hours in Rachel's backyard assembling it, their hands sticky with glue and their faces smudged with dirt. When the rocket finally launched into the air, Ethan let out a delighted cheer, and Jack laughed, a sound Rachel realized she had never heard from him before. "This is the best day ever," Ethan exclaimed, his hazel eyes sparkling as he looked up at Jack. "It's pretty great," Jack agreed, ruffling Ethan's curls. Then he glanced at Rachel, his expression softening. "Thank you for letting me be here." Rachel nodded, her throat tight. She could see how much Jack cared for Ethan, and she couldn't deny the bond forming between them. But she also couldn't shake her own fears. Letting Jack into Ethan's life was a risk, and she didn't know what the future held. What if Jack decided this wasn't what he wanted after all? What if he hurt Ethan, intentionally or not? That night, as she tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at her with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, do you think Jack likes dinosaurs too?" Rachel smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "Why don't you ask him next time?" Ethan nodded, his eyes heavy with sleep but his smile lingering. "I like when he's around," he murmured before drifting off. Rachel stayed by his bedside a little longer, her heart full of conflicting emotions. She wanted to protect Ethan from the uncertainties that Jack's presence brought, but she also wanted to see him happy. And for the first time, she began to wonder if those two desires could coexist. Jack, too, lay awake that night, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. His mind replayed the day, Ethan's laughter, his wide-eyed wonder as the rocket soared. The way Rachel's guarded expression softened ever so slightly. For the first time in years, Jack felt something he hadn't expected: contentment. But with it came a quiet determination. He wanted to be part of Ethan's life. Not just for a few weeks or months, but for the long haul. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was worth it. For Rachel. For Jack. And for Ethan. A new relationship was beginning to take shape, one filled with hope, uncertainty, and the possibility of something extraordinary. Rachel was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out a coffee cup, when her phone buzzed loudly on the counter. She glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number flashing across it. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but something made her reach for the phone, wiping her wet hands on a dish towel as she answered. "Hello," she said cautiously. "Ms. Whitaker." The voice on the other end was brisk, professional. "My name is Caroline, and I'm a reporter with the Daily Tribune. I'm calling to ask if you'd like to comment on the recent news about your son and Jack Preston." Rachel froze, her heart lurching in her chest. "What news?" she asked, her voice suddenly hoarse. There was a brief pause on the line, as if the reporter was gauging her reaction. "It's just come to light that Ethan is Mr. Preston's son," Caroline said. "The story is set to run tomorrow. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to share your side before it goes public." Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. "How did you find out?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "I'm afraid I can't disclose that," Caroline replied smoothly, "but I'd advise you to prepare for the media attention. This story is going to generate a lot of interest." Rachel ended the call without another word, her hand shaking as she set the phone back on the counter. She barely had time to process what she'd just heard before the first knock came at the door. Peeking through the window, she saw a small crowd of reporters gathered on her lawn, cameras flashing and microphones at the ready. "Miss Whitaker, is it true your son is Jack Preston's illegitimate child? How long have you been keeping this from the public? Does Mr. Preston plan to claim custody?" The questions came rapid-fire, muffled through the door but loud enough to make Ethan, who had been playing in the living room, come running. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, his wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Rachel forced a calm she didn't feel, crouching down to his level and putting her hands on his shoulders. "It's nothing, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady despite the panic bubbling beneath the surface. "Just some people asking questions they shouldn't be asking." Ethan frowned but didn't argue, trusting her words. Rachel led him away from the windows, locking the doors and drawing the curtains as she went. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do next. She needed to talk to Jack. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number, her hands trembling. He picked up on the second ring. "Rachel? What's wrong?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. "There are reporters on my lawn," she said, her voice shaking. "They're saying someone leaked the story about Ethan." "Jack? How did this happen?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I don't know," Jack said finally, his tone grim. "But I promise you, I'll find out. I'll make this right." "You can't make this right," Rachel snapped, her frustration spilling over. "My son is scared. And his life is being turned upside down because of you." Jack's silence was heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but resolute. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. You have my word." The next few days were a blur of chaos. Rachel refused to let Ethan go to school, fearing the media would follow him there. The phone rang incessantly, with calls from journalists and strangers offering opinions Rachel didn't care to hear. Even trips to the grocery store became impossible without being hounded. Ethan, usually so cheerful and resilient, withdrew into himself. He stopped asking about Jack, instead spending hours in his room with his books and toys. One evening, Rachel found him sitting on his bed, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. "Mom," he said quietly, looking up at her. "Did Jack tell those people about me?" "No, sweetheart," Rachel said quickly, pulling him into her arms. "Jack didn't do this. Someone else did." But it wasn't his fault. Ethan buried his face in her shoulder. Then why is this happening? I thought Jack cared about us. He does, Rachel said, stroking his hair. Sometimes, when people know someone famous like Jack, they try to hurt them by spreading things they shouldn't. This isn't your fault, Ethan. And it's not Jack's either. Even as she spoke the words, her anger at Jack lingered. Whether or not he was directly responsible, this chaos was a result of his presence in their lives. She couldn't ignore the damage it was causing, not just to Ethan but to their entire sense of stability. Jack tried to call several times, leaving messages that went unanswered. Finally, he showed up at her doorstep one evening, his usually polished appearance replaced with something more vulnerable. His tie was loose, his hair slightly disheveled, and his expression heavy with exhaustion. "Rachel," he said when she stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind her to keep Ethan from overhearing. "I needed to see you. I've been working non-stop to contain this. I hired the best PR team, the best lawyers. I'm doing everything I can. It's not enough," Rachel said, her voice trembling with anger and sadness. Ethan doesn't understand why his life is suddenly a headline. He's scared. Jack. And so am I. Jack's face crumpled, guilt etched into every line. "I never wanted this for you. For either of you. I swear. If I could take it all back, I would." Rachel's shoulders sagged under the weight of her frustration. "You can't take it back," she said softly. "All we can do now is move forward. But, Jack, you have to give us space. I need to figure out what's best for Ethan." Jack hesitated, pain flickering in his eyes. But he nodded. "I'll respect whatever you decide," he said. "But please, tell Ethan I didn't mean for this to happen. Tell him I care about him." Rachel nodded tightly, tears stinging her eyes as she watched him walk away. For the first time, she wasn't sure if letting Jack into their lives had been the right choice. And yet, she couldn't deny the ache in her chest as she closed the door, shutting out the world and all its chaos. The days after Jack's visit were quieter, but the stillness felt heavy, as if the weight of the scandal lingered in the very walls of Rachel's home. The reporters had thinned out, the buzz of the story fading as the media shifted its attention elsewhere. But the damage was already done. Ethan was more subdued than Rachel had ever seen him. His laughter, once a constant presence in their house, was now a rare and fragile thing. Rachel spent her days trying to hold everything together. She juggled work and parenting with the kind of focus that only fear and necessity could bring. But her mind was rarely at ease. Every time she looked at Ethan, she felt a pang of guilt. She'd opened the door to Jack Preston, and now her son was left carrying the weight of that choice. One evening, as Rachel was cleaning up after dinner, Ethan approached her, holding a folded piece of paper in his small hands. His eyes were wide and earnest, filled with a determination that caught her off guard. "Mom, can I send this to Jack?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Rachel dried her hands and knelt down to meet him at eye level. "What is it, sweetheart?" Ethan handed her the paper. "It's a letter. I want to tell him I'm not mad at him." Rachel unfolded the letter carefully, her heart tightening as she read the simple, heartfelt words. "Dear Jack, I miss you. I didn't want you to go. I know the people outside were mean, but I know it wasn't your fault. I want to see you again. Can we still be friends? Love, Ethan." Her hands trembled as she folded the letter back up. Ethan's words were so innocent, so unguarded, that they brought tears to her eyes. She pulled him into a hug, holding him close as she tried to steady her voice. "You really want to send this to Jack?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded against her shoulder. "I like him. Mom, I know you're worried, but I'm not scared anymore. I just want to see him." Rachel took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She'd worked so hard to protect Ethan, to shield him from anything that might hurt him. But maybe she'd been too focused on her own fears. Maybe it was time to trust her son's instincts. The next morning, Rachel called Jack. When he answered, his voice was tentative, a mix of surprise and hope. "Rachel, I'm calling for Ethan," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "He wrote you a letter. He wants to see you." There was a pause. And when Jack spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I'd like that. Tell me when and where." 2 days later, they met at the same park where Jack and Ethan had first raced down the path. This time, Jack arrived early again. But he looked different. Gone was the polished, confident man Rachel had first met. Instead, he seemed humbled, almost uncertain. As he waited on the bench, his hands resting on his knees. When Ethan spotted him, he broke into a run, his curls bouncing as he shouted, "Jack!" Jack stood and knelt just in time to catch Ethan in a hug, his arms wrapped around the boy tightly, as if he never wanted to let go. "I missed you too, buddy," he said, his voice warm and filled with relief. Rachel watched from a distance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She still wasn't sure if this was the right thing to do, but seeing Ethan's joy made her want to believe it was. Jack and Ethan spent the afternoon playing and talking. Jack brought a small journal for Ethan, explaining that it was for him to write down anything he wanted, questions, stories, even drawings. Ethan accepted it eagerly, already flipping through the blank pages with excitement. Later, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jack approached Rachel with Ethan by his side. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me this chance." Rachel nodded, though her defenses were still up. "This is about Ethan," she said. "I just want him to be happy." Jack met her gaze, his hazel eyes steady. "That's all I want too." In the weeks that followed, Jack and Ethan began to rebuild their relationship. They met regularly, always in simple, low-pressure settings. Jack made a point of respecting Rachel's boundaries, keeping her informed of every plan and ensuring she was comfortable with every step they took. Slowly, Rachel began to see that Jack's intentions were genuine. He wasn't trying to disrupt their lives or take Ethan away, he simply wanted to be part of his son's world. For Ethan, having Jack back in his life brought a lightness Rachel hadn't seen in months. He came home from their outings bubbling with stories about the things they'd done, from building a birdhouse to visiting a science museum. His confidence grew, his natural curiosity and joy flourishing under Jack's attention. One evening, as Rachel tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at her with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, do you think Jack loves me?" Rachel's throat tightened. She sat on the edge of his bed, brushing a curl from his forehead. "I think he does, sweetheart. Very much." Ethan smiled sleepily, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I think I love him too," he murmured before drifting off. Rachel stayed by his bedside a little longer, her heart full of conflicting emotions. For so long, she'd been afraid of what letting Jack into their lives might mean. But now, for the first time, she began to feel a cautious sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward together. Spring arrived quietly, bringing with it warmer days and blooming flowers. And with each passing week, the bond between Jack and Ethan grew stronger. Rachel watched as her son's confidence flourished under Jack's care. The boy who had once been hesitant to ask questions about his past was now eagerly sharing his thoughts and ideas, peppering Jack with an endless stream of curiosities during their outings. At first, Rachel had insisted on being present for every meeting. Her protective instincts wouldn't allow otherwise, and she'd sit nearby, pretending to read or check her phone while keeping a watchful eye on them. But as time went on, she began to let her guard down. Jack's commitment to Ethan was clear, not just in his actions but in the way he listened to him, the way he treated him with respect and genuine affection. One Saturday morning, Jack arrived at Rachel's house with a broad smile and a large cardboard box. Ethan, curious as ever, rushed to the door, his face lighting up when he saw Jack. "What's in the box?" Ethan asked, bouncing on his toes. Jack grinned. "A surprise. Come on. Let's open it together." They carried the box to the backyard, where Jack revealed its contents, a birdhouse kit, complete with wooden pieces, paint, and brushes. Ethan's eyes widened in excitement. "We're going to make this?" he asked, already pulling out the supplies. "That's right," Jack said. "And once it's finished, we'll hang it up so the birds can move in." Rachel watched from the kitchen window as they worked together, Jack patiently guiding Ethan through each step of the process. The two of them laughed as they painted the birdhouse, their hands covered in streaks of bright blue and yellow. When they were done, Ethan proudly held up the finished product, a slightly crooked but beautiful creation that he couldn't wait to hang in the tree. Later that afternoon, as Ethan ran off to play in the yard, Rachel stepped outside with a pitcher of lemonade. Jack was sitting on the porch steps, wiping paint from his hands with a rag. He looked up as she approached, his expression softening. "He's really happy," Rachel said, handing him a glass. Jack nodded, his gaze following Ethan as he darted around the yard. "He's an incredible kid," he said. "You've done an amazing job raising him." Rachel sat down beside him, her heart tugging at his words. "It hasn't always been easy," she admitted. "But he's worth it. Every single moment." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of birds chirping filling the air. Rachel found herself relaxing in Jack's presence, the tension that had once defined their interactions slowly fading. For the first time, she began to see him not as a threat to their life but as someone who truly cared about Ethan. One evening, Jack stayed for dinner, a simple meal of spaghetti and garlic bread that Ethan had helped Rachel prepare. The atmosphere was warm and easy, filled with laughter as Ethan recounted his latest school project, a diorama of a prehistoric scene complete with clay dinosaurs he'd molded himself. "Jack, do you know a lot about dinosaurs?" Ethan asked as he twirled spaghetti around his fork. Jack chuckled. "Not as much as you do, I'm sure. But I'm always happy to learn." Ethan's face lit up. "I can teach you. I have a book with all the coolest ones in it." "That sounds like a plan," Jack said, smiling. "We'll have to schedule a dinosaur lesson soon." After Ethan had gone to bed that night, Rachel and Jack lingered in the living room, the dishes from dinner still drying in the sink. Jack hesitated for a moment before speaking, his tone uncharacteristically uncertain. "Rachel, I just want you to know how much I appreciate you letting me be part of Ethan's life. I know it hasn't been easy." Rachel looked at him, her expression softening. "You've earned it, Jack. I'll admit, I was scared at first. I didn't know if this would be good for him. But seeing the way he lights up around you, I know I made the right choice." Jack's gratitude was evident. And for a moment, they simply sat there in quiet understanding. It was a small step, but it felt like progress not just for Jack and Ethan, but for Rachel too. As the weeks turned into months, the dynamic between the three of them continued to evolve. Jack became a regular presence in their lives, not just during scheduled outings but in everyday moments. He helped Ethan with his homework, attended his school play, and even joined him for a father-son event at the local community center. Rachel's initial hesitation was slowly replaced with trust, though she still kept a careful eye on their interactions, determined to protect Ethan at all costs. One evening, Ethan presented Rachel and Jack with a drawing he'd made in his new journal. It depicted the three of them standing under a bright yellow sun, smiling with their arms around each other. Above the figures, in his wobbly handwriting, Ethan had written, "Me, Mom, and Jack." Rachel's throat tightened as she looked at the picture. Jack's expression mirrored her own, a mix of emotion and quiet wonder. Neither of them said anything, but in that moment, the unspoken truth was clear. They were becoming something more than just two separate parts of Ethan's life. They were becoming a family. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to navigate, boundaries to define, and fears to overcome. But for the first time, Rachel felt a glimmer of hope that they could make it work. Together, they were building something new, something rooted in love and trust. And for Ethan, that was all that mattered. The first snow of the season arrived quietly, covering the neighborhood in a soft white blanket. Ethan stood by the living room window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched flakes drift lazily from the sky. "Mom, do you think Jack likes snow?" he asked, turning to Rachel with wide eyes. Rachel smiled as she folded a basket of laundry. "Why don't you ask him when he gets here?" Ethan's grin widened, and he darted back to the window, his excitement barely contained. Jack was due to arrive any moment to spend the afternoon with them, and Ethan had already planned out every minute a snowball fight, building a snowman, and ending with hot chocolate by the fire. When Jack's car pulled into the driveway, Ethan ran to the door, flinging it open before Rachel could stop him. "Jack," he shouted, his voice ringing with joy. Jack stepped out of the car, his scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, and waved. "Hey, buddy, ready for some snow?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically and grabbed Jack's hand, pulling him toward the yard. Rachel followed, bundling herself up as she stepped outside. The air was crisp and cold, but the sight of Ethan and Jack laughing together warmed her in a way she hadn't expected. They spent the afternoon building a lopsided snowman, complete with a carrot nose and a scarf Jack had sacrificed for the occasion. Ethan insisted on naming it Mr. Frosty, declaring him the best snowman ever made. When the snowball fight began, Rachel found herself reluctantly dragged into the fray, her initial protests drowned out by Ethan's giggles and Jack's good-natured teasing. Later, as they sat by the fire with steaming mugs of hot chocolate, Ethan leaned against Jack, his eyelids heavy with sleep. Rachel watched them from her armchair, her heart full. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known she needed. Jack's presence in their lives had become something she no longer feared but welcomed. And seeing Ethan so happy made her realize how far they had come. "Thank you for today," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Jack looked up from the fire, his expression warm. "It was my pleasure. Days like this are what it's all about." Rachel hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I wasn't sure we'd ever get here, but I'm glad we did. Ethan's happier than I've ever seen him." Jack's gaze softened. "That's because of you, Rachel. You've given him so much love and stability. I'm just lucky to be part of it." Rachel looked away, her cheeks flushing slightly. She'd spent so long keeping Jack at arm's length, afraid of what his presence might mean for their family. But now, she realized, he wasn't here to take anything away from them, he was here to add to it. Over the next few weeks, their new normal began to solidify. Jack became a fixture in their lives, joining them for dinners, helping Ethan with his school projects, and showing up at his soccer games with a thermos of hot chocolate and a camera in hand. The transition wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of uncertainty, conversations that tiptoed around unspoken fears, but the foundation they were building felt strong. As Christmas approached, Ethan's excitement reached new heights. He spent hours drawing pictures of Santa and writing a wish list that included everything from a dinosaur encyclopedia to a rocket ship. Rachel found herself swept up in his enthusiasm, decorating the house with twinkling lights and garlands while Christmas music played softly in the background. One evening, as they trimmed the tree, Ethan looked up at Rachel and Jack with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we could invite Jack for Christmas Eve?" he asked, his tone hopeful. Rachel glanced at Jack, who looked equally surprised and touched. "If Jack wants to come, we'd love to have him," she said, her smile gentle. Jack nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. "I'd love to be here, Ethan. Thank you for asking." On Christmas Eve, the house was filled with warmth and laughter. Snow fell steadily outside, turning the world into a winter wonderland. The smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air, mingling with the soft crackle of the fire. Ethan insisted on wearing his Santa pajamas. And he danced around the living room as Rachel and Jack exchanged amused glances. After dinner, they gathered around the tree to open one gift each. Jack handed Ethan a carefully wrapped package, his smile widening as the boy tore into it. Inside was a beautifully crafted leather-bound journal with Ethan's name embossed on the cover. "Wow!" Ethan breathed, running his fingers over the smooth leather. "This is so cool. What's it for?" "It's for you to write down all your amazing ideas," Jack explained. "Stories, drawings, anything you want. It's your way of keeping track of all the incredible things you come up with." Ethan beamed, clutching the journal to his chest. "Thank you, Jack. It's the best gift ever." Rachel watched the exchange, her heart swelling with gratitude. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen Ethan so happy. Jack had become more than just a part of their lives, he had become family. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch, Rachel and Jack sat by the fire. The room bathed in a warm glow. "You've given him so much," Rachel said quietly. "Not just today, but every day. I see how much he looks up to you." Jack shook his head, his voice soft. "He's given me more than I could ever give him. He's changed my life." "Rachel, both of you have." For the first time, Rachel allowed herself to believe that this was the beginning of something beautiful. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't always be easy, but it was theirs. Together, they were creating a new kind of family, one built on love, trust, and the unwavering promise to always put Ethan first. As the new year dawned, Rachel, Jack, and Ethan found themselves settling into a rhythm that felt natural and whole. The challenges that had once seemed insurmountable now felt like stepping stones toward a brighter future. Jack had become more than a presence in Ethan's life, he was a guiding force. A source of laughter, wisdom, and unconditional love. For Rachel, what had started as a cautious acceptance of Jack's role had blossomed into a partnership built on trust and mutual respect. One crisp January morning, as snow sparkled on the ground, Ethan handed Rachel and Jack a new drawing from his journal. It depicted the three of them standing beneath a shining sun, their smiles bright and unguarded. Above the figures, in bold letters, he'd written, "My family." Rachel's eyes glistened as she looked at Jack, who simply nodded, his own emotions clear. They weren't perfect, but they were together. And that was enough. This story reminds us that family isn't defined by blood but by love, perseverance, and the courage to build something new. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to follow more heartwarming stories from Life Stories.